Smoke curls over frozen fjords, carrying the scent of iron, ash, and fear. In the shadows of longships, unseen eyes watch, and the quiet before the raid hums like a heartbeat. These were not mere warriors, they were arbiters of fate, draped in blood and bound to gods who feasted on mortal terror. Every axe raised, every shield shattered, was part of a ritual older than memory itself. The world they touched would remember not only the destruction, but the whispers, the scars, and the invisible chains left behind. In this story, power is ruthless, faith is merciless, and survival comes at a price no soul could imagine. Welcome to a world where conquest is ceremony, and every act of violence is both law and legend. The North Sea was calm that morning, eerily calm, as if the waves themselves were holding their breath. Then, from beyond the mist came the rhythm that Europe would come to fear for centuries, the steady pounding heartbeat of oars. Dozens of longships cut through the fog, each one a streak of painted wood and iron. Their sails, dyed crimson, moved like blood across the horizon. The people on the coast had seen that color before, and they knew what it meant. The wedding of war had begun. For the Vikings, war was not merely a campaign, it was a ceremony. The preparation of the longship was as sacred as the preparation of a bride. Shields were polished until they gleamed like mirrors. Axes were sharpened until they could shave a man's arm clean. And men sang songs of death, not with sorrow, but with longing. Theirs was a culture where battle was a form of devotion, where violence was not sin, but sacrament. To die with a weapon in hand was to be accepted into Valhalla's feasting halls, seated beside gods who drank from skulls and laughed at mortal pain. The longships carried not just warriors, but witnesses, bards, seers, and priests of Odin who would carve runes into the hulls, binding luck to the crew and cursing the land they sailed toward. The warriors joked as they rowed, but their eyes were hard, and beneath their laughter was the grim understanding that each raid was a kind of ritual, a bloody covenant between man, God, and destiny. When they landed, the earth trembled not from their weight, but from their purpose. Villages were not conquered, they were consumed. Flames were as common as dawn, and the smoke that rose from the rooftops became the Vikings' true banner. They did not simply destroy their enemies, they humiliated them. It was not enough to defeat a foe in battle. One had to break his spirit, erase his name, and claim everything that had once defined him. In Viking thought, power was inheritance through terror. The sagas speak of raids, where the spoils were not gold or silver, but the memory of fear itself. When a village fell, it was said that its survivors became offerings of shame, tokens left for the gods of conquest. Women, children, even livestock, each became part of the ritualistic aftermath, transformed into living symbols of submission. The chroniclers of later centuries, horrified but fascinated, would write of these practices in trembling Latin, their words wrapped in euphemism because the truth was unbearable even to record. They wrote of bonds of marriage forged in fire and vows sealed in blood, as if trying to make sense of the madness through the language of ceremony. To the Vikings, war was a union between destruction and creation. Every raid was both an ending and a beginning, a way to erase weakness and plant new strength in the ashes. When they took what belonged to their enemies, they believed they were fulfilling fate, not defying it. A conquered land was not stolen. It was claimed by right of courage. The women left behind were not merely survivors. They were trophies of divine selection, living proof that Odin favored the strong. But beneath this divine logic was something more human and far more disturbing, fear disguised as faith. Every ritual, every act of conquest was a desperate attempt to keep the chaos of the world at bay. The Vikings lived in an age where winter could starve an entire clan, where plague could erase generations, and where death lurked behind every wave. In such a world, power was not luxury, it was survival. And survival demanded cruelty dressed as destiny. By the time the longships pulled away, the coastline looked less like a battlefield and more like an altar. Smoke drifted across the waves, carrying with it the smell of burnt wood and something fouler, something that clung to the lungs and refused to leave. The warriors did not look back. They never did. To look back was to question, and to question was to risk doubt. The longships moved silently into the distance, oars slicing through the black water as if erasing the memory of what had just been done. In their wake, Europe would remember only fragments: the red sails, the screams, the sudden stillness afterward. Yet for the Northmen, it was just another ceremony completed, another vow fulfilled. The wedding of war had ended, and the gods they believed were pleased. Every empire had its law. Rome had its tablets of bronze, the Saxons their royal decrees. But the Vikings carried their law in the timbers of their ships and the scars on their hands. Theirs was a code without parchment, spoken in storms, enforced by fear, and remembered in sagas. The longship was not only transport, it was parliament, temple, and grave. Its law was as fluid as the sea it sailed, and just as merciless. The first commandment of that floating world was simple: the ship is sacred. To strike it in anger or damage it through carelessness was an insult to the gods who breathed wind into its sails. The longship was their womb and their coffin, delivering men into battle and, if need be, returning them as corpses beneath its boards. Those who disrespected it were often offered back to the waves as payment. Discipline aboard was absolute. Aboard a Viking ship, each man knew his station. The steersman guided, the oarsman obeyed, and the jarl commanded. A single mistake could doom them all. The rhythm of their oars was their heartbeat, and hesitation was considered treason. The longship was a single creature made from many men, and the one who broke its rhythm risked becoming its sacrifice. Their guiding principle was drengskaper, the code of the honorable man. It demanded courage, honesty, and endurance. A Viking could be forgiven for failure, but never for cowardice. A man declared neither a coward or oathbreaker was stripped of his weapons, his hair shorn, his name cursed. For them, to lose honor was to die twice, once in flesh, once in memory. Punishment was swift and symbolic. A thief might be tied to the mast and whipped until he bled into the planks. A liar could have his tongue cut or branded. The worst punishment was abandonment. When a man defied an order in battle, the longship simply rowed away without him. The sea would decide his guilt. To die alone, unheard and unseen, was the purest form of Viking justice. Even the division of loot followed ritual law. Every coin, every scrap of cloth, was measured and shared according to rank. The jarl took 2 shares, the helmsman 1.5, the rest 1 each. The gods themselves received a portion through sacrifice, sometimes human. It was said the ocean could sense greed. To cheat in division was to summon storms. Justice on land mirrored justice at sea. Disputes were not settled by speech, but by steel. To fight was to prove divine favor. To live was to prove one's truth. The Northmen believed the gods despised hesitation. Words were only wind strength was proof. But Viking law was not chaos dressed as order. It was fatalism given structure. They believed every rule mirrored the god's own suffering. Odin sacrificed his eye for wisdom, Tyr his hand for honesty, and so every warrior was expected to sacrifice mercy for balance. Their cruelty was not madness, it was maintenance. A wrong left unpunished was a wound left to rot. The longship's code forged men who were both soldiers and symbols. They could sing before killing, laugh before dying, and pray while setting fire to villages. Each act, however savage, was justified as obedience to order. The longship did not carry men, it carried belief. What kept them united was not loyalty to their leaders, but reverence for function. A Viking was measured not by lineage or wealth, but by usefulness. Aboard the ship, equality was brutal. Every man, noble or slave, had value only if he could row, fight, and endure. The sea did not care for titles. The waves demanded strength, and so the longship became both court and executioner. When it sailed, its oars carved judgments into the water, each stroke a declaration of purpose. It was said that the ship itself remembered those who obeyed, became part of its legend, and those who defied were erased, swallowed whole by the same waters that once bore them to glory. In that silence, beneath the endless gray of the northern sky, law was not written but lived. It whispered in the wind that filled their sails, echoed in the rhythm of their rowing, and lingered in the cold breath of the sea. And when the longship returned from war, carrying spoils and ghosts alike, its deck bore the same message it had carried since the first oar touched water. The sea forgives no one, but it always remembers. The Vikings did not worship peace. They worshipped motion, the endless surge of tide, blood, and birth. Their gods were not gentle shepherds of men, but vast, merciless forces that demanded participation in creation's violence. Freyr, Freya, Odin each ruled over the cycle of growth and death, where life was borrowed from suffering and repaid through sacrifice. The Norse world had no word for innocence. Everything that lived was already guilty of consuming something else. When the harvest failed, they said the gods were hungry. Offerings were brought to the altars not as humble prayers, but as transactions: blood for bread, pain for plenty. The sacred groves of Uppsala were said to drip with crimson, the roots darkened by centuries of offerings. Even the trees seemed to breathe. Ravens gathered above the branches like smoke, waiting for what the gods did not take. The air itself tasted of iron, and the people believed the gods were pleased only when the earth drank deeply. Freyr, the god of fertility, was carved not as a benevolent spirit, but as a warrior with a weapon too heavy to be lifted by mortal men. His temples were filled with carved boars, symbols of strength and plenty, each one destined for ritual slaughter. The feasts that followed blurred the line between celebration and devotion. The people ate what they believed had been sanctified by death itself, believing that the gods partook through them. Every mouthful was both blessing and burden, a reminder that survival was always paid for. The rites of spring were the loudest. Villages gathered under gray skies, bonfires rising like pillars between snow and soil. The seers chanted the ancient verses, their voices breaking in rhythm with the drums. They said each drop of blood spilt on that night became a promise to the earth that the fields would bloom, the wombs would bear, and the sea would forgive. It was not cruelty, but balance. The Vikings understood that creation demanded witnesses, and that beauty could not exist without something to rot beneath it. Even their myths reflected this pattern. The world, they believed, had been built from the corpse of a slain giant, his skull the sky, his bones the mountains, his blood the sea. Existence itself began with dismemberment. So too did renewal. When a warrior died bravely, his blood joined the same sea that had once drowned his ancestors. In their belief, nothing was wasted, not even death. Every act, from childbirth to warfare, was simply another verse in the song of exchange between man and God. Foreign monks who witnessed these customs wrote about them with trembling disgust. They described unholy rites and devil feasts, yet their horror only proved how far their faith was from understanding the North. The Vikings were not savages to themselves. They were caretakers of a fragile balance that demanded participation, not prayer. Where Christianity sought forgiveness, the Norse sought equilibrium. To give nothing was to offend. To give too little was to invite famine. Faith, to them, was a contract written in blood and renewed each season. In quieter moments, they still prayed, not for kindness, but for endurance. The women who sowed seed into the frozen soil whispered to Freya, as though to a sister in suffering. The men who hunted across snowbound forests muttered to Odin for strength, not mercy. Every life was a small ritual, every breath a minor offering. They lived surrounded by reminders that their gods were near and watching, and that their favor could turn to fury as quickly as the weather. As centuries passed and Christianity spread through the North, the old gods faded but never vanished. Farmers still poured ale on their fields before planting. Sailors still spoke to the wind before raising their sails. Even when the priests forbade it, the people remembered the price of fertility, the idea that nothing grows without something being given in return. The language changed, the symbols softened, but the hunger beneath it all remained. For the Vikings, fertility was not tenderness. It was endurance disguised as faith. Blood, seed, storm, and soil all were threads of the same tapestry. They did not separate life from loss, love from fear, or death from growth. The gods of blood and fertility demanded acknowledgement of that truth, that the world feeds on itself, endlessly, beautifully, and without apology. And when the fires of the rituals dimmed, and only embers remained under the northern sky. The people whispered the same promise their ancestors had made for generations: quiet, reverent, and eternal. May what we give return. When the smoke cleared and the raiders withdrew their blades, what remained was silence, the kind that hummed like a wound. Behind the burning walls, behind the piles of splintered shields, the survivors gathered in trembling clusters. The Vikings called them thralls, a word that meant both slave and servant, but in truth it meant possession. The raid was over, the ownership of human life had begun. The taking of captives was not chaos, it was commerce. The Northmen treated it with the same discipline they gave to shipbuilding or battle. The strongest men were chained first, their fates decided by the jarl. Skilled laborers might be spared for ransom. Farmers and healers were often kept alive. The rest became part of the trade that fueled the North's expansion. Across rivers and seas, the Vikings sold people as others sold furs or silver. To them, it was not cruelty, it was continuity. Life was currency, and every conquest needed to pay for itself. Those chosen to remain were marched to the ships at dusk. Bound and silent, they walked through ash-like shades in a half-burnt world. The longships loomed ahead, those wooden serpents that had swallowed so many coasts whole. To the captives, they were not vessels but sentences. The moment they stepped aboard, their old names ceased to exist. The sea would carry them to a new one. Aboard, the air was thick with salt and smoke. The raiders sang to keep time, voices deep as the oars striking the water. Between verses, the prisoners heard laughter, the kind that sounded more ritual than joy. Some tried to speak, to plead, but were met with the same cold efficiency as in battle. They were not worth hatred, they were worth value. That distinction made it worse. The Vikings justified their treatment of captives through a logic older than mercy. Fate, they believed, had chosen both victor and victim long before the raid began. The Norns, the weavers of destiny, spun each man's thread, and if yours ended in chains, it was because the gods required it. Resistance was seen not as courage, but as ignorance of the divine pattern. To suffer was not injustice, but participation in the will of the cosmos. At night, the captives lay beneath the decks or on open shore, depending on the journey. The sky above them was indifferent, its stars glittering like eyes that neither pitied nor judged. The warriors slept near the fires, wrapped in furs and satisfaction, while the captured shivered beneath thin scraps of cloth. In the morning, the same sun rose for both. That too was part of the lesson. The world did not discriminate it, only remembered who had the power to act within it. Some captives were kept as laborers, others given to farms and households across Scandinavia. A few, those of rare beauty or skill, were absorbed into their captors' lives in ways that blurred the line between servant and shadow. Children born from such unions were often unnamed for weeks, as families waited to see whether fate would mark them as gifts or ghosts. In this way, the Viking world absorbed what it conquered: not just land, but bloodlines, memories, and fear itself. The sagas mention these captives rarely, but when they do, it is with unease. They tell of servants who whispered to ghosts, of women who sang foreign lullabies that made warriors weep, of men who plotted in silence for years before vanishing into the night. The Northmen feared vengeance as much as they revered destiny, and in that fear, they built legends. Some said the sea itself was full of the drowned who sought their stolen homes, their voices echoing in the tide when the wind turned east. To the Vikings, captivity was both warning and mirror. It reminded them that fortune was temporary, that the same gods who favored them today could reverse the threads tomorrow. Many a warrior, struck by bad luck or betrayal, found himself chained on the same ships he once commanded. Fate was not loyal, it was hungry. By the time the captives reached their destinations, most had stopped speaking their own tongues. The sound of their old language became a memory too painful to hold. Yet something of them remained in the land, the way a burned house still smells of smoke long after it cools. The North grew rich on their labor, but haunted by their silence. And when the wind swept through the villages at night, rattling the wooden doors and howling across the fjords, the people whispered that it was not the sea they heard, but the breath of the captives still waiting for morning. In Viking society, freedom was not a birthright. It was a privilege that could vanish with the swing of a sword or the loss of a gamble. Beneath the farmers, warriors, and jarls stood the thralls, enslaved men and women who made the North's prosperity possible. Their hands built ships, forged weapons, and tilled the frozen soil. Yet their names were seldom written down. They existed in the margins, necessary but disposable, their worth measured only by their usefulness. The Norse word thrall comes from eidral, meaning one held by another. It was a simple word for a complex hierarchy. A thrall could be taken in war, born from other thralls, or sold across seas like livestock. They were property in the most literal sense, counted among a household's goods, traded for iron, or gifted to mark alliances. In law, the same term that described oxen could describe them. Yet, this was not random cruelty. It was engineered control. The North survived by hierarchy. Owning thralls marked status. A farmer might own a few, a jarl, hundreds. Entire estates ran on their labor, from grinding grain to maintaining ships for raids. They cooked, built, and sometimes fought beside their masters, though never as equals. When a free Viking died, his thralls were often buried or sacrificed with him, bound to serve in the afterlife as in life. It was not mercy. It was loyalty enforced beyond death. Unlike later chattel slavery, the Viking system offered a narrow door of escape. A thrall could, in theory, earn or buy freedom through loyalty or skill. Some did, becoming Leysingi freedmen. Yet the stain of bondage clung to their bloodline. Their children were half free, permitted to live, but not to forget. In a world obsessed with honor and lineage, that mark was a scar more visible than chains. What made the system last was its normality. The saga spoke of thralls not as victims, but as fixtures of life. They were expected, like hunger or winter. To question their existence was to question the gods' order. The Gragas of Iceland and the Gulathing codes of Norway punished killing a thrall with fines, not outrage. One did not offend heaven by killing a thrall, only the owner's purse. Daily life was a cycle of endurance. Thralls slept near hearths or in small huts, ate what remained after the free folk, and worked from dawn to exhaustion. Many were foreign Celts, Slavs, or Anglo-Saxons whose tongues still carried songs of home. Over time, those words mixed with Norse speech, shaping the Scandinavian dialects to come. The thralls were silenced, yet their voices lingered in the language itself. Here lies the Viking paradox. A people who worshiped freedom built their world on bondage. They celebrated courage through conquest, not compassion. The same men who carved runestones praising bravery also branded human flesh. To them, fate justified all things. The gods chose who ruled and who served, and to resist that order was to resist destiny itself. Yet doubt flickers even in their myths. Odin, god of wisdom, once wandered disguised as a slave. The poets said he sought knowledge through humiliation, that even the All-Father had to kneel before he could rise. Perhaps they sensed that power was only borrowed, that every master was a thrall to something greater. When Christianity crept across the north, the old order began to crack. The new faith whispered that all souls were equal before God. Slowly, reluctantly, that idea took root. Church records from the 11th century tell of thralls freed for the sake of salvation. But even as the practice faded, its shadow lingered. Generations carried its memory, shaping class and labor long after the longships vanished. In the end, the thrall system was not just an institution, it was a mirror. It revealed the cost of civilization, the human bones beneath its foundation. The Vikings conquered seas and wrote their names in history, but their empires rested on the backs of the forgotten. And though the sagas praise kings and jarls, it was the thralls, the nameless multitude, who truly built the north. And when the wind howls through the fjords, rattling the old farms where no masters remain, some say it carries the rhythm of unseen hands still working, still serving, still waiting to be remembered. In the Viking world, the trade of flesh was as common as the trade of iron. To the Northmen, the body itself was currency, living proof of conquest and survival. Across harbors lined with ships, markets rose where no law reached but the law of silver. It was there, among the creaking docks and smoke-thick air that human life was weighed like grain and priced like wool. The Vikings called it manhandle, the trade of men. To them, it was not evil, it was inevitable. The raiding season filled their holds with captives, and what was not kept for labor or ransom was sold. From the fjords of Norway to the river markets of the East, the trade became a lifeline that connected worlds otherwise divided by faith and fear. Foreign merchants came willingly. Arabs, Byzantines, Franks, all sought the strength of northern bodies, prized for their endurance and obedience. In the bustling ports of Hedeby and Birka, the cries of traders mixed with the chants of priests, each calling on different gods to bless the same transaction. Bronze scales swung, coins clinked, and destinies changed hands. The market itself was ritual. Captives stood in rows, stripped of their names and worth, while buyers examined their teeth, their backs, their scars. The Vikings prided themselves on discipline, no chaos, no cruelty beyond purpose. To them, this was not murder but maintenance, the invisible machinery that kept the North alive. If the gods demanded blood, the merchants demanded payment. What made the trade thrive was not greed alone, but pragmatism. The northern soil was thin, the winters merciless. Wealth came not from crops, but from control. A single thrall sold in the east could fund an entire voyage west. The same longship that carried warriors to raid monasteries might return, loaded with silver, spices, and human souls. The Vikings were not savages, they were businessmen with axes. The routes stretched far beyond the saga's edges. From the Baltic Sea, ships moved along the great rivers of Rus toward the Black Sea, where Byzantine gold awaited. Some captives ended their journeys in distant palaces, their Norse captors praised for efficiency and reliability. In a grim irony, the same men who worshipped Odin in the cold north supplied slaves to empires that bowed before Christ and Allah. Profit, not faith, ruled the tide. The system was precise. A young man fit for labor might fetch 1 mark of silver, a skilled woman twice that. Children were cheaper, though often sold in numbers. Every sale was recorded in runes, etched on wooden tablets or carved into memory. And when the silver piled high enough, sacrifices were made to the gods who blessed the trade. It was said that Thor guarded the merchants' voyages, while Odin watched over the captives' fates. To those who witnessed it, the market was not chaos but theater. Drums beat, songs rose, and traders toasted to success as if celebrating the harvest. Even the gods were imagined as spectators, smiling upon a commerce that blurred sin and survival. Yet beneath the laughter, something colder moved, the understanding that in this world, anyone could be reduced to a price. There were moments when the illusion cracked. A mother might call her child's name as the buyer led him away. An old man might whisper a curse in a language the Northmen didn't understand. Those sounds lingered longer than the coins ringing. They haunted the docks after the traders left, weaving into the wind that swept through the empty stalls. The Vikings did not see themselves as villains. They saw balance, taking and giving, ruling and serving. In their sagas, they were conquerors, not slavers. In their minds, they were maintaining order in a world built on chaos. Yet history remembers differently. The wealth that filled their halls came from lives spent in chains, from tears turned into treasure. When the markets closed, the ships sailed again, their decks heavy with silence. The coins gleamed in the lamplight like tiny suns, but beneath their shine lay the memory of those who bought freedom with their breath. And as the longships vanished into the horizon, the waves carried whispers the merchants pretended not to hear, echoes of names they had tried so hard to erase. Because in the north, silver glittered bright, but memory glittered longer. In the Viking world, ownership was not simply declared, it was sanctified. The taking of a life, a land, or a body demanded ritual, because without ritual, power was meaningless. Every conquest had to be witnessed by the gods, sealed not just with blood, but with belief. The ritual of claiming was how the Norse turned violence into law and possession into destiny. It began when the longship returned from war. The air stank of iron and sweat, the decks slick with the memory of battle. Captives were gathered at the center of the settlement, surrounded by torches that burned even in daylight. Here, before the chieftain's hall, The victors presented their spoils not for celebration, but for consecration. To own, in the eyes of the gods, one had to prove worth. The ritual was not written in any saga, yet it appeared in fragments of law codes and priestly chronicles. Each region had its own version. In some, it began with the sprinkling of mead, a gesture of peace. In others, with a slash across the palm, a gesture of power. The symbolism was simple but absolute. What was taken by the sword must be cleansed by oath. Those chosen to witness were not mere bystanders. They stood as the human link between the earthly and the divine. A priest of Odin might recite verses from the Havamal, while Osiris, the vulva, traced runes into the dirt. Each rune represented a form of ownership, one for land, one for wealth, one for human souls. Once carved, they were buried beneath the feet of the captives, ensuring that even the ground remembered who held dominion. For the thralls, this was the moment when freedom ended not just in body, but in spirit. The ritual broke the invisible line between enemy and property. Once the priest declared the oath complete, no man could challenge the claim without inviting divine wrath. The gods themselves were witnesses, and to defy the owner was to defy fate. There was, however, an unsettling grace in the way it was done. The Vikings believed that the act of claiming transformed both parties, the master into a steward of the god's will, the captive into a vessel of purpose. They spoke of balance, of cosmic duty, but beneath those lofty ideas was something far simpler, control disguised as sanctity. Some accounts describe how a small portion of salt or earth was placed in the captive's mouth. It symbolized the new bond, the taste of the land they now belonged to. Others mention a ceremonial washing in icy rivers, a cleansing of the past life. The captives were then renamed, often in mockery or symbolism. A woman might be called Freya's gift, a man Odin's debt. Their true names vanished like breath in winter air. For the chieftains, the ritual served another purpose: unity. Each claiming was a public display of authority, reminding the community that even the gods bowed to order. The men who fought were rewarded not with mercy, but with structure. The women who labored, the children who watched it, was all theater reinforcing one truth: survival required obedience. Yet not all who participated believed in it. The vulva, the seeress, often whispered her doubts in coded prophecy. Some poems suggest she pitied the thralls, warning that those bound by oath would one day haunt their masters in dreams. Others tell of chieftains who grew paranoid, convinced that the gods demanded payment beyond silver and blood. In these stories, the ritual became a curse, a chain that bound conqueror and conquered alike. Outside the north, chroniclers saw only barbarism. Christian monks, hearing tales of these ceremonies, called them pagan baptisms of sin. Yet even they noted the order, the precision, the strange reverence with which the Vikings approached ownership. It was not chaos they worshipped, it was hierarchy. Every rune carved, every chant spoken, every coin exchanged, each was a verse in a scripture of control. When the torches finally dimmed and the crowd dispersed, the new captives were led away, some to farms, others to distant ships. Behind them, the earth held the buried runes, silent witnesses to the moment when a life was rewritten by ritual. For those who performed the claiming, it was proof that the world made sense, that might could become meaning. But history remembers differently. To modernize, the ritual stands as both ceremony and confession, a glimpse into a culture that wrapped its brutality in beauty. The Vikings believed that by sanctifying domination, they tamed chaos. Yet in truth, they only gave it a name and prayed the gods would never ask for it back. To understand how the Vikings justified slavery, conquest, and ritual sacrifice, you have to step inside their gods' cold logic. The Norse did not see morality as a universal truth. They saw it as a bargain, one struck between humans and the unseen forces that ruled the world. If fate word declared your victory, then your right to dominate was not cruelty, it was destiny fulfilled. The Norse pantheon thrived on hierarchy and exchange. Odin sought wisdom through blood. Thor defended order through violence. Freyr and Freya governed fertility, demanding offerings to keep fields alive and wombs full. The gods took, The people gave, and in return, the world kept turning. Within that system, slavery was not sin, it was symmetry. Those who lost in battle paid their cosmic debt through servitude. This worldview was not a mistake of ignorance. It was a theology of control. The sagas describe a universe where everything had its price. Courage, freedom, even the favor of the gods. To be born free was a blessing from Odin. To become a thrall was the god's punishment, or worse, indifference. No Viking saw equality in the eyes of the divine. The world itself was built from the corpse of a god Ymir, torn apart to create sky, sea, and soil. Creation began with conquest. Priests and poets kept this reasoning alive. The skald's court poets wove it into verses that praised the chieftain's victories as divine approval. When a warrior captured slaves, he wasn't defying the gods. He was imitating them. Just as Odin sacrificed others for knowledge, a chieftain sacrificed enemies for order. The same logic that sanctified battle sanctified bondage. At feasts, these beliefs took on theatrical form. After a raid, when the mead flowed and the fires roared, warriors would boast not only of their kills, but of those they claimed. Their words were a strange mix of gratitude and cruelty, thanking the gods for providing labor, pleasure, and proof of dominance. The chieftain would raise his cup and invoke Odin's name, ensuring that each act of possession was framed as divine economy. But this justification went deeper than drunken ritual. It was written into the laws. The Gragas and Gulathing codes didn't just regulate ownership. They treated it as a sacred right. A thrall's life had a set price payable in silver. Killing one was not a sin against humanity, but a breach of property. The gods cared for oaths, not for pity. Justice meant balance, not mercy. Women too were folded into this theology of hierarchy. Freya, goddess of fertility and desire, was revered yet constantly bartered in myth. Her body symbolized both creation and transaction. To the Norse mind, power and possession were intertwined. Just as the gods claimed her favors, men claimed their women. The line between divine worship and human ownership blurred until they became reflections of each other. Yet even within that cold system, cracks appeared. Some Volar female seeresses whispered of visions where the gods wept for mankind's arrogance. A few skalds hinted that the gods' hunger for sacrifice might one day devour their own worshippers. These murmurs did not challenge faith openly, but they left shadows in the sagas, a sense that even the gods feared the mirror they had created. When Christianity began creeping across the north, missionaries found this logic both horrifying and brilliant. They called it blasphemy dressed as philosophy. But the Vikings saw their new faith as merely another bargain. Many converted not out of conviction, but out of calculation. If one set of gods could bless conquest, perhaps another could too. They baptized their slaves while still owning them, covering old chains with new prayers. The pagan justification did not die, it evolved. It survived in laws, in stories, in the quiet assumption that strength is virtue and suffering is fate. The Norse did not need to hate their slaves, they only needed to believe the universe required them. And belief, more than the sword, kept the system alive. In their mythology, the gods themselves were doomed to fall at Ragnarok, yet they faced that end without remorse. To them, destruction was not evil, it was inevitable. That same fatalism echoed in every Viking household. The thrall who served, the master who ruled, both played roles written long before their births. No one escaped the script. They only performed it. The pagan justification was not merely religion, it was resignation. A way to make peace with the violence that built their world. To the Norse, cruelty without purpose was madness. But cruelty with divine approval, that was civilization. In the sagas, vengeance was not sin, it was symmetry. To the Vikings, justice wasn't blind, it had a sword and a name. Among the countless stories carved into memory, few burned brighter than those of the shield maidens, the women who refused to kneel. They were rare, but they existed, living contradictions in a world that demanded obedience, wielding weapons in defiance of gods and men alike. And when wronged, their revenge was not only personal, it was myth made flesh. The tale begins, as most do in the north, with blood. A woman's husband slain in a feud, her home raided, her kin taken as thralls. The sagas never name her the way they name her enemies, but her deeds survive in fragments. She buried her dead in silence, sharpened her blade, and prayed not to the gods for mercy, but for witness. Because vengeance, in that world, was not crime, it was restoration. For Viking women, vengeance carried a double weight. It defied not just the killer, but the order of society itself. The Graga's laws declared that women were bound to the decisions of their male relatives. They could not seek blood price without consent, but shield maidens were never interested in permission. They stood outside the law because the law never protected them. Where the sagas saw chaos, they saw correction. These women were forged in the same fires that hardened their brothers. They trained beside men, sailed on raids, and stood in shield walls when the world called them unnatural. Yet their fury was more dangerous than the blade they carried. The gods, after all, had written their fates to serve, not to strike. So when they struck, it was an act of rebellion against fate itself. That was what terrified the North, not their strength, but their defiance of destiny. Archaeologists have found graves of such women bodies, buried with weapons, horses, and silver. For centuries, scholars insisted they must have been ceremonial burials or mistakes. A woman could not have been a warrior, they said, yet the bones disagreed. One grave in Birka, Sweden, held a full arsenal: sword, spear, shield, 2 horses, and game pieces, a strategist's tomb. Her DNA proved what the sagas only whispered, that the myths of shield maidens were not fiction, but history. The North remembered them not because they were common, but because they were unforgettable. Their vengeance was rarely clean. In one saga, a woman named Hervor calls upon her dead father's ghost to claim his cursed sword, turfing. When he warns her it will bring only ruin, she replies, "Then let ruin come." Her fury becomes her inheritance, her defiance her prayer. In another, Gudrun kills her husband and feeds him to his brothers for betraying her family. Her revenge becomes legend, her grief immortal. The sagas never judge them, they simply record. Because in that world, morality was measured by memory, not mercy. But behind the legends lay a harsher truth. For every shield maiden celebrated in verse, countless others vanished unnamed. Women taken in raids, sold as slaves, or forced into foreign households sometimes found quieter forms of revenge. They poisoned their masters, smothered infants born of rape, or whispered secrets that toppled entire families. Their resistance was invisible, but it rippled through the generations. Their silence was sharper than steel. The Norse believed that the dead watched the living, that honor and vengeance echoed in the afterlife. A woman who avenged her kin could walk proudly into Valhalla, beside the men she had slain. Yet even there the gods kept their order. Freya's hall, Folkvangra, took the first choice of the fallen half of them women. The rest went to Odin. It was a divine reflection of earthly hierarchy. Even in death, the balance of power endured. When Christianity began spreading through the North, it tried to bury these stories. The church called vengeance a sin and submission a virtue, but the old spirits were stubborn. For centuries, the memory of the shield maiden haunted folklore, her ghost riding the wind, her laughter echoing through fjords at night. Mothers warned their sons not to break oaths, lest the woman with the sword come for them. She became less a person and more a curse, a symbol of justice the gods themselves feared. In the end, the shield maiden's revenge was not just blood repaid, it was prophecy, a reminder that even in a world ruled by fate, defiance could still carve its own name into the stones. The Vikings believed every life was a thread woven by the Norns, but the shield maidens proved something terrifying. Some threads, once cut, could still strangle. The cross did not arrive in the North. On a breeze of mercy it arrived, hidden in trade ships and treaties. Christianity didn't conquer with swords. It conquered with symbols, law, and guilt. The Vikings, who once carved their gods into wood and bone, were about to be carved themselves, reshaped into sinners. The missionaries came in robes instead of armor, but their mission was war, all the same. They spoke of light, but what they brought was surveillance of the soul. Every impulse, every instinct, every desire the old gods once blessed was now branded as sin. The Northmen had lived by courage and fate. The Christians offered obedience and shame. The exchange was not spiritual, it was strategic. At first, the Vikings laughed. A god who died nailed to wood? A heaven where warriors sang but never fought? Absurd. Yet the church was clever. It did not need to win by faith, only by fatigue. The sword could conquer land, but guilt could conquer memory. And slowly, guilt did what no army ever could. It made warriors kneel willingly. The Jarls saw opportunity before revelation. Baptism was not a confession, it was insurance. A baptized Jarl could trade safely with Christian kingdoms, raid with one hand and pray with the other. Many accepted the cross not for salvation, but for strategy. They dipped their heads in holy water, wiped their mouths, and ordered the next raid. God was good for business. But the church was patient. It knew that time could do what terror could not. As the generations passed, the old stories began to warp. The thunder of Thor became superstition. Odin's ravens turned to devils, and the rituals once performed under the moon were replaced by confessions whispered in dark corners. The Norse gods were not defeated, they were defamed. The victors rewrote them into villains. Yet the irony was divine. The church that condemned slavery inherited it neatly. The same bishops who preached equality owned thralls in the name of stewardship. Pagan captives were baptized before being sold. Sin washed off like dirt, so their resale value would rise. Redemption had a price tag. Faith had a profit margin. The difference between a raid and a crusade was branding. In monasteries, labor became prayer. Men who once forged swords now copied scripture until their fingers bled. Women who had once ruled households or led rites as seeresses were turned into daughters of Eve, creatures blamed for temptation. Where Norse law had allowed divorce and inheritance, church law chained them to obedience. The age of the shield maiden ended not with a sword through her chest, but with a sermon. The cultural conquest was thorough. Yule became Christmas. Ostara became Easter. The feast of Freya became the feast of the Virgin. The old gods were not erased. They were translated, sanitized, and dressed in Latin. The church learned from the pagans even as it destroyed them. It took their festivals, their symbols, even their fears, and claimed them as miracles. But not all conversions were peaceful. When Christian kings rose in Norway and Denmark, they burned the temples of the old gods, drowned the seeresses, and forced baptisms with blades at the throat. The rivers of baptism ran red, and the priests called it divine victory. The gods of blood were gone, but the thirst remained. Only the rituals changed. For the Vikings who survived this transformation, the shock was less spiritual than existential. Their world had traded strength for salvation. Once, to die with a weapon was glory. Now to live in submission was grace. Once they believed fate was carved into the stars. Now it was dictated from pulpits. The same terror that once came from the sky now came from within. The church did not just conquer the north, it conquered the idea of rebellion itself. The warriors who once laughed in the face of death now wept before confessionals. The raiders who feared no king now feared their own thoughts. Civilization had arrived, and it wore a halo made of iron. In the sagas that followed, you can almost hear the silence the moment the songs stopped sounding like war and started sounding like prayer. But beneath the hymns, something still stirred. In every storm, in every flash of lightning, the old gods whispered reminders. The cross had claimed the land, but the thunder never asked permission. Because faith can be taught, but fear it remembers. Fear was currency in the Viking Age, more valuable than silver, more binding than oaths. Every axe, every shield, every arrow traded hands under its invisible weight. The Northmen understood it as the gods did, an instrument of power, a tool of survival, and the cost of living under it was exacting. Villages whispered about the raids, but the tales often concealed the true terror. The screams, the flames, the blood, these were only the surface. Fear lived in the marrow, in the slow retreat of courage, in the way children learned to sleep with one eye open. The North did not need armies to dominate. The reputation of cruelty did the work. One raid, one massacre, could shape generations of obedience. The Jarls cultivated this terror meticulously. Captives brought from foreign coasts were displayed before departure, their chains gleaming in the sun, their lips sealed by the certainty of pain. Women who resisted were punished first, their suffering a public lesson. Men who dared question commands were humiliated in front of comrades, stripped, beaten, sometimes bound to posts for days while the winds scoured their flesh. This was not random cruelty, it was a ledger, a balance sheet of control. Fear was taught, but also inherited. Children watched fathers perform acts of horror as if they were sermons, learning that courage meant brutality and obedience meant survival. Boys were not raised to be warriors, they were raised to be instruments of terror. Girls were not trained to be wives, they were trained to recognize it, to wield it when needed, or survive it when not. By the time they came of age, the North had molded them into both perpetrators and witnesses, the cycle self-perpetuating. The sagas hint at the psychological toll, though never with the sympathy modern readers demand. The men who returned from raids sometimes refused to sleep near others, haunted by the echoes of screams they had caused. The women who survived captivity whispered of nights when their children cried, and they could hear, faintly, the voices of the dead among the waves. Even in victory, the Northmen were not unscathed. Fear left marks as permanent as sword scars, invisible but no less real. Even law codified terror. Punishments were ceremonial, public, and symbolic. A thief might be flayed or mutilated, not to satisfy rage, but to set a standard. A liar might be exiled into the forests, left to the wolves, because the memory of disappearance was more instructive than death alone. The message was clear. The community itself was the instrument of fear, the enforcer of fate. Disobedience was a contagion. Terror was the antidote. Yet fear was double-edged. The same force that secured obedience could breed rebellion. In distant fjords, isolated communities sometimes rose against Jarls, using knowledge of terrain and tides to strike with sudden, devastating precision. Every act of defiance was risky, but it reminded the Northmen that terror was never absolute. It demanded maintenance, constant reinforcement, and a readiness to escalate when even whispers of doubt appeared. Religious rites amplified fear. Sacrifices, once routine offerings to gods of war and fertility, became instruments of obedience. Captured slaves, bound and trembling, were sometimes offered to Odin or Freya, their screams a hymn sung in the key of dread. The ritual fused belief with control, reinforcing the idea that defiance invited divine attention and not in the form of mercy. To fear the gods was to obey both heaven and hearth. And yet, beneath all this calculated terror, life continued in mundane rhythms. Farmers plowed, children played near fjords, and the wind carried gossip as it always had. But the memory of fear lingered, like smoke in the rafters, a constant companion to every interaction. Even laughter was cautious, measured against the knowledge that fate, like the Jarl or the gods themselves, was watching. By the end, fear was not merely a weapon, it was infrastructure. It held society together, controlled labor, secured loyalty, and ensured survival. But it came at a price. The Northmen lived in a world of shadows, haunted by the echoes of their own terror. Courage and cruelty were indistinguishable, and obedience was paid for in the coin of trembling hearts. The sagas close each tale with deeds remembered, but never with the dread endured. The silent victims, the ones who survived yet never spoke of it, were the true ledger of Viking life. And in the fjords, when the wind howled and rattled the loose planks of abandoned homes, the North whispered a simple truth. The gods did not need to strike, for fear itself would always be enough. War did not end with the clash of steel. It began anew in the cries of children. Wherever Viking longships carved through rivers and fjords, small eyes watched the destruction, hearts beating in rhythm with fire and death. These children born into conquest, stolen from homes, or conceived in the shadow of battle were not merely survivors. They were witnesses, symbols, and instruments, forged in terror before they could even speak. Every scream, every sigh, became a lesson in the hierarchy of power, a curriculum in survival written in blood. Their first memories were of smoke, splintered wood, and the echoing rhythm of oars striking water like the pulse of the gods themselves. Captive infants were sometimes spared, held trembling in the arms of mothers, whose own bodies had been violated and whose souls quivered under the weight of fate. The Vikings saw these children as threads in the tapestry of destiny, meant to be woven into their world. Thrall's other survivors of raids often raised them, enforcing obedience with the same discipline demanded in shipyards and battlefields. Here, cruelty was education, survival was memorization. Every child, whether kidnapped or born in captivity, was proof that conquest demanded continuity. Bloodlines, labor, and loyalty folded into one. Even in the chill of northern winters, the youngest were pressed into the rhythm of work and war, their bodies learning endurance before their minds could question it. Not all children were captives. Some were born of shield maidens or warriors, conceived amid chaos, their first cries drowned by the clash of swords and the screams of the fallen. Sons were taught stealth, ferocity, and endurance almost before they could walk. Daughters learned cunning, patience, and subtle power. Childhood was never innocence. It was apprenticeship. Each lesson, each scar, was a covenant with fate, a contract signed in the ink of violence and fire. The screams of training echoed alongside the groans of those who failed, and both were considered necessary for shaping the next generation of Northmen. The sagas rarely mention these young witnesses, and when they do, it is in whispers and euphemisms. One recounts a boy sleeping beneath shields while his father executed prisoners, the lullaby of steel and death accompanying him. Another tells of a girl whose thrall mother sang in foreign tongues, her voice softening the rage of warriors drunk on conquest. These stories reveal a grim truth. For Viking children, play was education, and education was survival. Every game mimicked raid or battle, every toy was a miniature weapon, every story a rehearsal for cruelty and cunning. Learning the art of war was relentless. Boys handled wood and iron long before weapons became their own. They watched executions, examined the spoils of raids, and absorbed the brutal hierarchy that governed the Northmen. Girls were schooled in the language of fear, when to hide, when to appease, when to strike. Both learned early that power was fleeting and cruelty was constant. To survive was to comprehend the world's indifference and wield terror as a shield. They memorized the rhythm of ships, the scent of blood, and the timing of attacks as lessons more vital than words. Vikings used children as psychological weapons. Captives, sent back to their villages, carried stories in their eyes and silence on their lips. The mere memory of what they had witnessed served as warning. Resistance invited ruin, defiance demanded punishment, and the gods favored the strong. Fear became inheritance, passed from one generation to the next in silence, as potent as steel. Sometimes the Northmen incorporated children into their households not as equals, but as instruments. They were trained to be skilled, beautiful, or cunning, molded to reinforce the dominance of their captors. They forgot their lands of birth, their language diluted, their identities overwritten. Childhood was stolen. Assimilation was survival. Innocence was sacrificed on the altar of conquest. The psychological toll was immense. Survivors bore trauma like armor, each scar a silent testament to the violence they had witnessed. Yet through suffering came a dark education, understanding that life demanded ruthlessness, cunning, and endurance. Fortune favored only those who seized it without hesitation. By the time they reached adulthood, these children were more than survivors. They had become inheritors of terror, vessels of fate, teachers of obedience, and mirrors of violence. And when the winds howled through the fjords, carrying whispers across villages long abandoned, it was said that the cries of the children of war still haunted the shores, reminders that conquest never truly ends. Every scream left behind became part of the land itself, a legacy written in silence, echoing across generations as a warning and a lesson in survival. History remembers the victors, but the sagas whisper of the silenced. For every tale of glory, of shields raised and longships triumphant, there are shadows too uncomfortable to etch in runes. The Northmen chronicled themselves in blood as much as ink, yet the screams of the conquered, the stolen, and the violated were often left unsaid. Their absence is a testament as chilling as any sword, a silence that speaks louder than the boisterous epics sung by skalds. The sagas were not impartial. They celebrated cunning and courage, recounting feasts in halls of gold, duels of honor, and raids that stretched coastlines into legend. Yet for all their detail, they are astonishingly quiet on the cost of conquest. Villages that burned are described as taken or pillaged, but the women who fled screaming, the children wrenched from cradles, the elders dragged into chains, these truths were softened, buried in euphemism, as if to protect the audience from the raw arithmetic of fear. To read a saga is to read through a veil, to sense devastation without naming it. This selective memory was deliberate. Vikings understood that reputation was power. Tales that dwelled too long on suffering could weaken their own image, turning awe into pity. The skalds, commissioned by jarls and kings, curated history like an artist painting over bruises. Every omission served a purpose. Fear, respect, and obedience required clarity in legend, but ambiguity in terror. The dead, the captured, the enslaved, these voices became the background hum beneath the crescendo of conquest. Yet in the margins, the silence is deafening. A line here, a stanza there, hints at horrors the main text cannot bear. One saga mentions a village emptied of life, and though the phrasing is neutral, it implies slaughter beyond comprehension. Another recounts a raid without resistance, which often meant survivors were bound, sold, or sacrificed. Reading carefully, the attentive eye can reconstruct the unspoken, the atrocities that lingered like smoke after the longships disappeared. The sagas themselves become a puzzle, their silences revealing more than their words. The Northmen themselves were aware of this duality. To the outside world, they were barbaric and merciless. Among themselves, they were disciplined and ritualistic. The saga's omissions mirror the Vikings' approach to power, display just enough to inspire, conceal enough to terrify. The gods demanded both praise and fear, honor and cruelty, memory and erasure. What was recorded was not truth, but theater. What was omitted, however, was terror preserved in perpetuity. This careful curation also extended to descendants. Children raised on tales of heroes were seldom taught of the victims. They learned that valor was measured in conquest, that wisdom was shown in strategy, that destiny justified devastation. Empathy was a luxury, obedience was survival. The saga's silence shaped minds as much as swords shaped bodies, instructing the next generation that power comes with the right to write history and the discretion to erase it. Despite the omissions, echoes survive in oral tradition. Minor characters, thralls, and women sometimes slip into memory, singing in foreign tongues or whispering of revenge. They appear not as central figures, but as stains on the narrative, spectral reminders of cost. Every saga, every skaldic verse, carries a shadow beneath its rhythm, a reminder that human suffering existed even when it could not be named. The attentive listener or reader senses the truth. The Northmen's victories were absolute only on the surface. The silence also serves as warning. Any who survived the raids carried these unspoken stories with them, transmitting trauma in whispers, in wary glances, in rituals designed to remember the dead without angering the living. Fear, once cultivated by violence, became institutionalized, encoded into the very way society functioned. The saga's omissions were not gaps, they were instruments, carefully tuned to teach obedience, awe, and the inevitability of fate. Ultimately, the sagas are mirrors of a civilization obsessed with power and legacy. They celebrate the bold and suppress the weak, immortalize the conqueror and erase the conquered. Yet within that erasure lies their darkest lesson. History is written not only by the victors, but by those who survive to tell it. And sometimes what is left unsaid resonates louder than any song, a silent testament to the horrors buried beneath the Northmen's golden halls and blood-stained shores. In those silences, the past waits, patient and unyielding, for those willing to listen. Archaeology does not merely unearth bones, it exhumes truth. Beneath layers of soil and ash, under stones pressed by centuries of indifference, lie the silent witnesses of Viking fury, remnants of massacres, shattered villages, and lives unrecorded. Each excavation becomes a confession, a whisper from the past that even the sagas dared not speak aloud. Human remains tell stories no skald could compose, revealing a world where violence was ritual, labor, and terror intertwined. Graves arranged in patterns or scattered chaotically across fields betray more than death, they reveal method. Skeletons bound with rope, sometimes stacked like cordwood, suggest the captured and condemned were not killed in panic, but with purpose. Arrowheads lodged in ribs, skulls cleaved by axes, teeth bearing the marks of starvation each tell of pain and precision, of a society that measured cruelty as carefully as it measured grain. Archaeologists unearth these fragments and, in doing so, confront the raw arithmetic of fear, the calculus of conquest. Artifacts tell their own grim story. Broken shields, rusted swords, and fragments of longships point to the machinery of violence. Everyday objects, beads, combs, cooking vessels found among skeletal remains suggest lives interrupted, innocence shattered. Children's toys buried beneath layers of ash, alongside adult weapons, hint at a childhood stolen by war. Even in mundane items, the imprint of trauma endures, a silent testament to lives claimed in the service of survival, power, and ritual. Sometimes the earth yields evidence of something more grotesque. Sacrificial pits, mass graves where humans and animals lie intertwined. These sites are not accidents, but offerings. The Vikings did not merely conquer. They communicated with the gods through blood and fear. Archaeology illuminates the method in what contemporaries called madness. Every layer of soil becomes a ledger of devotion, each body a line item in a ledger, paid to appease unseen deities. Analysis of trauma patterns shows consistency across sites. Men often exhibit defensive wounds, forearms fractured from blocking blows, ribs shattered in close combat. Women frequently bear marks of binding or strangulation. Children, the smallest victims, sometimes show no visible wounds, only burial patterns that indicate suffocation, exposure, or neglect. The archaeological record transforms anonymous horror into a discernible strategy. Violence was not random. It was education, deterrent, and offering rolled into one. Yet even in destruction, the Vikings left traces of humanity, or at least acknowledgement of the individual. Some victims were buried with personal effects, coins pressed into hands, combs tucked beside hair. These were not acts of mercy, but of ritual. To die was not enough. One had to be offered properly to the gods, lest the soul become restless and revengeful. The archaeological evidence thus paints a portrait of a society in which life, death, and terror were inseparable, bound together in a web of superstition, survival, and spectacle. The geography of atrocity also matters. Raids were not random longships, followed rivers and fjords like veins feeding into the heart of conquest. Sites near rivers often show signs of repeated violence, layers of destruction built atop layers of destruction. Villages that survived the first incursion rarely survived the second. Archaeology exposes patterns that sagas obscure: systematic terror, territorial domination, and the harnessing of fear as both shield and sword. Even today, the findings resonate with the same shock that contemporaries must have felt. Modern researchers standing over a trench of bones can sense the magnitude of what occurred. They see not myth but method, the logic of violence codified in timber, iron, and flesh. The past is not inert. It is a witness that demands attention. The earth remembers what scribes omitted, recording atrocity with unflinching honesty. Through archaeology, we confront a paradox: admiration for Viking skill and craftsmanship, and horror at their methods. The same hands that built formidable longships and intricate brooches also raised homes, bound the innocent, and offered blood to appease gods. The record is uneven, but the lesson is clear: power was inseparable from terror, devotion inseparable from destruction. In the silence of the grave, the shadows of the conquered speak. Every unearthed skeleton, every fragmented artifact, is a testament to the human cost of conquest, the grim choreography of violence, and the uncomfortable truth that history remembers the victors, but the earth never forgets. Archaeology does not merely reconstruct events, it reconstructs morality, exposing the raw, unvarnished consequences of a society obsessed with fate, honor, and the gods' thirst for blood. The gods who drank from skulls did not fall in a single moment, nor did they vanish in silence. Their decline was a slow bleed, witnessed not in lightning or fire, but in the subtle erosion of fear and faith among the living. Across the north, villages that had once trembled at the mention of Odin or Freyr began to whisper new prayers, muttered not to the old gods, but to strangers bearing crucifixes. The blood that had once sanctified conquest and sacrifice now dried in the sun, its potency fading under the weight of changing belief. The saga of the blood gods' fall is etched less in stone than in the hearts of those who serve them. Warriors who had dedicated their lives to the rhythm of wars and the taste of slaughter felt the pull of uncertainty. The rituals that had been as natural as breathing sacrifices to ensure victory, offerings to fertilize fields, and the binding of fate in chains suddenly seemed hollow. Even the bravest shield-bearer hesitated, sensing that the gods who had promised triumph were retreating, leaving only silence and smoke. With the arrival of Christian missionaries, the ritual landscape transformed. Crosses were erected where wooden idols once stood. The loud chants of the skalds gave way to quiet hymns. Villagers who had offered the firstborn, the thralls, and the spoils of battle to gods of war now lifted candles instead of axes. Yet the old ways did not vanish immediately. The memory of blood magic lingered in farmyards and mead halls. Farmers buried charms in fields and carved runes into beams, uncertain if they honored gods or superstition. The transition was a collision, not a conversion, a centuries-long negotiation between fear and faith. The fall was also practical. Warfare itself began to change. Longships still sliced through rivers, but the terror that had once accompanied the Northmen's approach began to wane. Targets that once surrendered before a blade now resisted, emboldened by rumors of a higher god who promised justice beyond mortal reach. The very tactics, sanctified by centuries of devotion to blood and iron, lost some of their potency. Victory no longer guaranteed divine favor. Defeat no longer proved dishonor. Faith, once a weapon, became a question. Priests of the old ways resisted in private. They performed sacrifices in hidden groves and inscribed runes in secret chambers. Yet each secret ritual was a confession of fear. They knew the power that had once been absolute was slipping, and the world they had controlled through terror was becoming ungovernable. Even Odin's seers, those who read the threads of destiny, spoke of a world where human cunning and the will of a foreign god could outweigh centuries of established law and ritual. Their prophecies were no longer assurances, they were elegies. The collapse of the blood god's authority left a psychological void. Men trained to interpret fear, as guidance now faced ambiguity. A shield maiden, who had once believed her survival owed itself to the favor of Freya or the strength of Thor, now realized that life and death were influenced as much by human choices as divine whim. Villages that had celebrated harvests with ritual blood offerings began to see fertility as labor and strategy rather than devotion. Morality began to creep into spheres that had been governed solely by terror. Yet traces of the old order persisted. Even as Christianity took root, bones unburied beneath earth or riverbeds whispered of past cruelties. Ritual scars on fields and in skulls reminded the living that the gods who had demanded blood were not entirely gone. They had merely been replaced, their authority fractured, their dominion challenged. Memory became a conduit for terror even in absence. Stories of wrathful deities, sacrificed thralls, and invincible warriors lingered in the hearthside tales told to frighten children or embolden youth. Ultimately, the fall of the blood gods was less an event than a metamorphosis. Power shifted from divine sanction to human law, from fear to faith, from ritual to conscience. But the lessons of the old world were never forgotten. Men and women, children and captives, carried forward the echoes of terror as both caution and inheritance. The blood gods may have faded, but their shadows remained in the shape of swords, scars, and stories, warning all who heard them that belief could conquer, and that fear, once learned, never fully dies. Long after the axes had dulled and the longships rotted in fjords, the echoes of the Viking world persisted. etched into stone, soil, and memory. Villages rebuilt over ash and bone, forests reclaimed burned fields, and rivers ran red only in the imagination of those who remembered. Yet the violence, the rituals, and the fear that had defined generations did not vanish. They became stories, warnings, and shadows haunting the edges of new empires. The past did not disappear. It whispered through the centuries, teaching that conquest leaves more than ruin, it leaves a mark on the human soul. The children of war grew into adults shaped by terror and loss, carrying with them the unspoken lessons of survival. They married, labored, and governed, but the memory of screams and the weight of stolen lives lingered like invisible chains. Every oath sworn, every sword forged, bore the imprint of what had come before. Even in villages that had never been raided, parents told tales of distant shores and crimson sails, instilling respect for power and fear of the unknown. History, in this sense, was not recorded on parchment alone. It was inscribed in flesh, in habit, and in the unsteady pulse of collective memory. The thrall system, once the backbone of the North's prosperity, gradually dissolved, yet its echoes persisted in class and labor. Freedmen inherited skill and servitude alike, their freedom tempered by the shadow of ancestral chains. Laws that had once commodified human life became tempered by ethics imported from Christian neighbors, yet moral ambiguity lingered. In meadows and courts, the lessons of obedience, betrayal, and reward, so long taught through cruelty, remained embedded in culture. A man who had once commanded thralls understood the fragility of dominion. A family descended from captives knew how endurance became a kind of power. Archaeology began to uncover the tangible remnants of these echoes, mass graves that whispered of ritual sacrifice, burned settlements revealing the rhythm of raids, and weapon-strewn fields testifying to both skill and horror. Each unearthed skull, each fragment of a longship's hull, told the story of a people who had fused life with fear, labor with terror, and devotion with death. Scholars peered into the soil centuries later and glimpsed the raw, unflinching humanity of the Northmen, their brilliance and their brutality, inseparable and eternal. Religion, too, carried forward shadows of the past. Christianity slowly replaced the worship of blood-soaked gods, yet many practices and beliefs were adapted rather than abandoned. Fertility charms, oath-bound rituals, and stories of divine favor lingered in folklore. Even saints' lives bore echoes of the sagas, battles, cunning, and judgment that mirrored the older, bloodier mythos. The divine had changed shape, but the function remained the need to explain, control, and justify human suffering endured. And in the imagination, the Vikings never truly left. Artists painted their battles, poets wrote of their cunning, and storytellers relived the terror. The longship became a symbol not just of conquest, but of the thin line between life and death, civilization and chaos. To recall the Northmen was to recall power in its rawest, most elemental form. Fear fused with cunning, ritual entwined with pragmatism, and violence codified as destiny. Every echo reinforced the notion that the past was never fully dead. It haunted, instructed, and demanded recognition. Even now, centuries later, the echoes shape behavior. Nations remember invasions, communities pass down tales of horror, and humanity absorbs lessons in obedience, courage, and cruelty. Fear, once a tool of conquest, became a teacher. Ritual, once a call to gods, became a template for societal order. Memory, once collective trauma, became history. The Northmen, long gone in flesh, survive in principle, the enduring lesson that power is transient, life is fragile, and legacy is written not in triumph alone, but in the shadows left behind. The wind still whispers along fjords and shores where longships once cut through mist. It carries with it a resonance of axes, chants, and cries. Anyone who listens closely can hear the pulse of oars, the murmur of thralls, and the faint laughter of gods now absent. Those who understand know it is not merely sound, it is history itself, echoing across time, demanding attention, respect, and remembrance. For the echoes of the Northmen are eternal, and their story, though dark and terrifying, is inseparable from the story of humanity itself.